Okay, I encourage you to take your seats. We're going to get started. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our very first Human Rights Summit. We call it the inaugural summit because we're planning to do this every year. A lot of people have asked me why we're organizing this event, but I have to say that I have asked myself why we didn't do it years ago, because it fits so perfectly with our mission and our way of working for change. At Human Rights First, we seek American leadership on human rights. People fighting for freedom around the world continue to count on the United States for support, and providing it is a moral obligation, but it's more than that. Leading on human rights, in our view, is also in the national interest. We reject the notion that the United States has to choose between its ideals and its interests. On the contrary, in our view, the country is stronger and more secure when it respects human rights and leads on human rights abroad. So that's what we do. We challenge our government to live up to its ideals. And to that end, we reach out to people from across the political spectrum. We pride ourselves at Human Rights First on our willingness and ability to form what some people view as surprising coalitions or strange bedfellows. We build bridges because that is the way to make change in Washington, and because throughout history, a strong bipartisan consensus has been the linchpin of American leadership on human rights. With this summit, we seek to strengthen bipartisan support for human rights and hope to create consensus behind concrete solutions and to build momentum for change. I couldn't be more excited to get started, so let's get started. It is now my pleasure to bring you a message from a human rights defender who needs no introduction, but I will give her one anyway, a short one. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton began her career at an NGO, the Children's Defense Fund. As Secretary of State, she has inspired us with her staunch commitment to the principle that universal human rights are the birthright of every person, including women, LGBT people, and people of faith. Through her tireless diplomacy, she has shown the world that advocating for human rights strengthens American leadership and advances global security.
I am delighted to join Human Rights First in welcoming human rights defenders from around the world. I am so touched that you have chosen to honor Ambassador Chris Stevens with the Beacon Award. Chris stood up for human rights in the best possible way, through the power of his own example. And to his family, once again, I thank you for the service and sacrifice of your son, who is so well loved literally around the world. And congratulations. This award would have meant so much to Chris. Because as Chris knew, and as a lot of you know, promoting human rights is risky work. You put yourself in harm's way because you know that respecting universal rights and freedoms is what makes it possible for people everywhere to live with dignity, to have a say in the decisions that affect their lives, to try to improve those lives and their communities. And the United States supports you in this. Advancing human rights is essential to our foreign policy. It's not only the right thing to do, but it also promotes national security and international stability. Societies that deny their people these rights and freedoms are on the wrong side of history. They're making the wrong bet. So thank you. Thank you for all you do to hold governments accountable for living up to universal human rights standards. Your work helps advance freedom and dignity and makes the world a more just, more peaceful place.
She is off today doing the work of human rights, so we're grateful that she took the time to record that special message for us. I'm pleased to be able to introduce our next speaker, who has been a leader in so many venues that it's hard to count. But the one that's nearest and dearest to me is that he has been the vice chair of our board of directors. He's more commonly known, though, in Washington as the Master of Disaster. Ken Feingberg is the quintessential problem solver. He's perhaps best known as the special master of the September 11th Compensation Fund, but that is just one of the many, many times that Ken has stepped into the middle of contentious legal battles and helped forge just resolutions. Time and again, the courts and political leaders turn to Ken because they know he's interested in nothing more and nothing less than figuring out a way forward that is fair and just. Early in his distinguished career, Ken was chief of staff for Senator Ted Kennedy, whose pragmatic idealism helped inspire his own career of principled problem solving. We are so grateful to have him as a leader on our board and to have him here today. Thanks, Ken.
I want to thank Elisa for that introduction. How lucky Human Rights First is to have her at the helm. There is no more effective advocate for human rights in this city than Elisa, and we count our blessings as a board every day that she's at the helm and directing our program and doing it with such skill and success. I also must acknowledge Bill Zabel's here today. Bill is one of the founding fathers of the organization. He is a national resource when it comes to the subject that drives us in our mission. We're grateful. Typical of Bill to come from New York City to be here today and to sit in on this and to add his words of wisdom. And he's just been a towering figure for the organization. Tom Bernstein will be here later, and he too is somebody that should be singled out for special praise. So I thank all of you. Now, most of you are here because you understand the mission. But I just want to point out that I've been involved with Human Rights First for 22 years. And I was drawn to the organization because of its mission, its mandate to advance the cause of human rights and human dignity. Remember that word, that phrase today, human dignity around the globe. When we see injustice, we act. And we don't just talk the talk. For an organization of our size and limited resources, we are extremely, I think, extremely effective in what we do. After 9/11, we became front and center in dealing with problem of human rights involving torture, improper interrogation, questions that we raised with policymakers, bipartisan, to try and rectify wrongs. After we heard that military recruits were telling their instructors at West Point that they wanted to be just like Jack Bauer, the hero of TV show 24. Led by Elisa, we took the dean at West Point and real-life interrogators out to Hollywood and had them meet with the writers, the script writers, the directors, just to get make sure Hollywood understood what was proper, what was right, what was not. 24's creator Howard Gordon said that meeting had a tremendous impact on him. My personal priority, more than anything else we do, the whole issue of immigration and how we enlist the legal community to help refugees seeking asylum. This is cutting-edge stuff. This is, the front line, dealing with refugees seeking asylum. It is one of the bedrock policies that we have addressed, I think, in a singular, successful way over the years. This is the way we make human rights durable. Shared commitment, bipartisan. There's nothing politically or ideological about what we do. We are looking for allies, red, blue, liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, independent. We welcome everybody under a big tent committed to the role of human rights. And we think, as the Secretary pointed out, human rights as an international mission is everybody's essential component of effective foreign policy. You cannot have an effective foreign policy without human rights playing a critical role in that regard. Now, final point. As we seek to foster American global leadership on human rights, we need to know what people think. Here in the United States, but in a very real sense, we need to know what people think abroad. What are their priorities? How do they look at the issues? How do they look at the United States? We cannot fashion specific foreign policy human rights objectives if we don't have the data, if we don't know exactly how we should frame our policy and our mission at Human Rights First based on the consumers of human rights around the globe. So today, we are indeed fortunate here today to have Jim Clifton here. Jim Clifton is the leader of Gallup. He's the CEO of Gallup since 1988. Gallup has long been, everybody knows Gallup, the country's premier polling outfit in the U.S., but what you may not know is Jim Clifton and Gallup are around the globe. I mean, they are everywhere. And in being everywhere, they can provide organizations like Human Rights First with the data we need to sift and channel our efforts, knowing this is what people around the globe are thinking. Gallup's World Poll continuously surveys citizens in 140 countries who represent 95% of the world's population. Its findings, its conclusions, inform us and inform other policymakers and activists everywhere as we address the world's pressing problems. What do people think? Ladies and gentlemen, it is very fitting that we start off this very unique two-day summit with thanks and appreciation that Jim Clifton himself is here today to tell us about what Gallup is doing, what they're finding, what lessons we can all learn. Jim Clifton.
Well, thank you, Ken, and thank you, Elisa. I just want to tell you, I have a feeling there's a lot of very empathetic people in the room here. I'm going to need that today. This is not a special subject of mine. I'm not an expert on this, so please keep that in mind. I have another problem, though. I prepared talking points last night, and when I talked to Elisa this morning over here, I changed them all. And then I talked to Ken for a while, and then I rechanged them all. So I'm a guy that's not very good on the subject that just rewrote everything. So if there are times when you're looking at me going, oh my God, he doesn't know what he's talking about or he's lost, that's exactly what I'm experiencing. But I've been in Washington long enough. I've tried to promise myself I'm not going to do any more just kind of standard remarks, do you know what I mean, where you can just kind of read something that I've written rather than having me here. So I want to make a few reckless remarks, Elisa, if that's okay. They're trying, but I want to be helpful. And I studied the organization, and I've asked some questions about who are your customers and what does the world think of human rights, Elisa asked about. And this is a reckless remark, but I want to make it. I think overall, you have to be very, very careful. Remaining relevant with an issue like human rights in this country, in this world right now, is very, very difficult. If I did a big poll of leaders or of the world, I think you'd fall very close to the category of I don't care. Now, this gets better, by the way, because the same thing has happened to environment. I mean, environment, weather change, it probably is the biggest problem we have, because if the scientists are right that the Earth is warmer than it's ever been and the seas are rising, it means the party's over at some time. That issue nobody cares about right now. And so, keeping that in mind, I wanted to try to answer the question of what do we do to make our issue relevant. So heads of state will really care when somebody says human rights. Here's the first thing, you guys. Whatever you do, you've got to have it tied to economics, and this is brand new, and I see this with every association, every organization that's fixing the world. Until it's tied to economics, the real leaders don't care. And so when you're working with foreign policy, when you're working with any governments, any staffs, as soon as it's tied to economics, everything changes. I wanted to tell you that. Another thing is that when you describe what you're doing, everything changes as soon as you can describe it with math rather than anecdotes. I know this sounds subtle, but as soon as you can describe the current state of the world mathematically rather than anecdotally, your own relationship, your issue's relationship to the whole world, I swear to God, will change more than you ever imagined. I have a question for you. If you're so good at this, what % of the world is suffering? There are 7 billion people, 5 billion adults. You know how many people are suffering? Well, how the hell do you do your jobs if you can't audit the world's suffering? I got a question for you. Scientists know that the temperature of the Earth is rising. Do you know if suffering is increasing or decreasing? Well, how do you manage it if you don't know which way it's going? Or if I said, what about Tunisia? What about Egypt? What about Pakistan? What about Iran? Are sanctions working in Iran? Well, how many people are suffering? We say, well, we don't know. We don't measure that. There's an incident that we don't like, but see, it's hard to get attention. It would be like if you and I ran a company and somebody came in and said, hey, I'm a shareholder. How are profits? And we said, oh my gosh, we don't know. We don't measure that. That's not really important to us. Well, are sales going up or down? We don't know. We don't have any idea. But we know a guy that got a really bad car somewhere. You see the point? When you can audit suffering, and this is a huge open space. There's a lot of experts on well-being. I don't like the happiness research. Ed Diener, that is the father of that's one of my best friends. There's richer work when you turn it upside down. Suffering predicts more than well-being. They're both great. They're both great scientists. But one of the things I wanted to recommend to you, why don't you become the world's leading living experts on suffering? Why don't you audit it? Why don't you have people write papers and know all of the different derivatives of it? Just like we do Wall Street, just like we do Dow, the Dow Jones. Have something that everybody watches. Not just for the world, but for every country. So you say is dignity. I love dignity. Are people being treated with more or less respect around the world? But tell me by country, just exactly like if we were running an IBM, we said, tell me about every single office around the world, how are we doing? That would be a breakthrough for human rights. You know how interested people are getting in big data? But as soon as there's a big data center for human rights, the relationship of human rights, that particular concept will change because everybody will call in there and they'll write their papers and they'll say, all these different events happened and respect for the individual got a little bit higher. By the way, one of the questions that we asked that I just love, that we asked the whole world is, I was treated with respect all day today. When that's going up, everything's getting better. When it's going down, hell is coming to it's one of the most powerful questions that you can ask. I'm going to watch my clock here. I have another reckless recommendation. Nothing really matters right now in discussions all around the world until your subject is tied to the current will of the world. And so when mankind, humankind, wakes up every morning, there's a will. And until your subject is tied to that will, it's not relevant. So a good question to ask Gallup would be, well, what is the will of the world? Our founder, Dr. George Gallup, by the way, he was an academic. He wasn't really a, he had some entrepreneurial talent, but he just kind of spent his whole life. You know, he got his doctorate degree at Iowa, then he taught at Northwestern, on to Columbia, and had the Gallup poll. But he had a mission that was really interesting to me. I kind of dedicated my life as a steward of that mission. But what he said is, if democracy is based on the will of the people, somebody should go find out what that will is. And that was it. Because you see, what Dr. Gallup was thinking is that if leaders have that particular assumption wrong, you get your assumption wrong, then the more we lead, the worse we make whatever we're leading. Excuse me, but one of my favorite ones is when you do a poll of 1.5 billion Muslims and you ask them what's wrong. So you say, well, it's you hate us for our freedom and all those kind of things. Well, what if it's not that? What if it's something else? You see, when you have a concept wrong, then you go out and you try to lead 1.5 billion people and you got the wrong assumptions. The more you lead it, the worse you make it, and we did that. So anyway, you might say, well, of all the data you've seen, Jim, from the United States, 75 years of Dr. Gallup's work, world polling, what's the most searing observation you've made about will? I'll tell you what it is. So he started polling 75 years ago. When we said to Americans, men and women, what's the great American dream? The great American dream used to be peace, pray to the God that you want, have a family, I don't know, freedom, those kind. That's what got us up to just recently. There's been a shift of interest. We have changed from peace, religion, freedom, and all of that, just recently, to having a good job. When I say it, it sounds subtle. But when America woke up this morning and you said, what are they really, their to-do list? What's everybody working on? To some degree, 1 degree, maybe 2 degrees, all of us have somebody that's out of a job. Or we're in a job that we don't want, or we're in a job that we want with a bad boss, whatever it is. But when the will of the United States of America is to have a good job, everything changes a little bit, but more than anything else. I want to just give you a couple of examples. When the great American dream changed to having a good job, here's just a real simple one. One thing is we get married later. That's a big one. Or we don't get married at all. That changes the whole fabric of America. And if we didn't have all that immigration coming up from Mexico, I know it's all from all over, but especially from Mexico, our demographics would be horrible. Here's another one. We have fewer kids because of the great American dream change. Or we don't have any at all. So it changes the very most basic makeup, but it also changes who we vote for. It also changes that when we come to work, we're asking a different question. We're no longer salary men. Sorry about that, ladies, but that's what we used to be called, salary men, because we didn't have a relationship to our job. Now we do. So when I wake up in the morning and I say, how do you take me? Do you take me as an individual? Do you take me for who I am? I'm really asking that question at my workplace, not at my church, not to my government, not anywhere else. So it changes how we have to lead. Well, so we were thinking about that, and we said, you know, we ought to just see if we can't crack the code on what the will of the world is. I'm going to speed this up. The will of the world is to have a good job. So if you said, how are they doing in any country right now, the Palestinian territories, everything's going to go back to that one. Human rights, economics, revolution, it's the most important one. I want to give you guys a pop quiz. By the way, so we do this tracking in Tunisia and Egypt. I love economics. But the economics in both Tunisia and Egypt, the GDP, per person income, household income, they're all going up. There's a huge misread here. So remember what the World Economic Forum said about Tunisia? It's a model of modern economic success. The problem with classic traditional economics is it measures the transactions of life, what people are buying and selling, but it doesn't ask them what they're thinking. So GDP is going like this, but when Gallup asks about suffering and thriving, thriving's crashing, suffering's going up. How could that be? Because the transactions of life don't deal with the will. And when we ask Tunisia and Egyptians how they're not doing well at all. So when suffering gets high enough and it's rising fast enough, and we don't have enough math on this yet, at some point it gets brittle and things fall apart. I just can't believe it. I'm sorry about this, but I know the Indian ambassador to the U.S. is kind of mad at me. I reported that just 5 years ago, suffering in India was about 15%. That's too high. Next year it went to about 18%, then it went to about 25%. Now this last year it's at 30%. Whatever's going on in India is not good. But you know, their GDP keeps growing. Now it's increasing at a decreasing rate. But so what you assume is, boy, look at India coming on. Suffering in India is growing faster than almost any other country. We show suffering increasing in Iran. We show it increasing in Pakistan, thriving, crashing. But until you have any kind of metrics like that, it's just an argument. I need to sort of wrap these remarks up so we can have some questions. I'm just thinking, if I was you, what would you want to know from me? And you would say, what's the very most core attribute, human attribute of suffering? And I'll tell you what it is. I want you to just, you don't have to shout it out, but I want you to just guess in your own minds, first of all. And I tell you, we have nailed this. And we had help from the very best outside academics. Kahneman was all over it and everybody else. The most deadly state of mind is hopelessness. That's the worst kind of suffering there is. And then if you start trying to unpacking it, it goes back to a job. Now, I'm better at males than I am females, so sorry about that one, because the data, the signal strengths are so strong there. But I just want to unpack one for you, and then we'll do some questions. But if you said, what's the worst state of mind for, I'm going to say, a young Muslim male, here it is. Out of work. Where's Ken? Okay, but if I'm out of work and that guy right there is out of work, unemployed, what we assume is that we have about the same amount of suffering that we're unemployed. But here's where hope plays a part. Because we say to him, do you have hope to get a job? And he goes, actually, I do. Remember, we're both out of work, though, so classic economics writes us down as unemployed. We say, do you have hope to get a job? He goes, yeah. He says, I'm actually working at a pizza place here in Cairo or somewhere, and they're going to give me the assistant manager job. Told me if I did my job well for a year, I might get manager job, but I got to finish this community college course or some sort of. So there he is. Remember, they think we're the same. Now you come to Jim and you say, Jim, do you have hope to get a job? And I say, I don't. I've been out of work for 18 months. I have given up. I will never get one. The difference in suffering, the difference in how we deal with our day, the difference of our to-do list is unimaginable. Our life outcomes are unimaginable. Whether or not we're going to help a stranger, whether or not we'll stand up for somebody else's rights, whether or not you think we're treated with respect all day, that's the single strongest correlate. But now you ask me this question, both of us, do you think your government is corrupt? And I say yes to that. Out of work, no hope, but I believe I live in a corrupt environment. Now, the life that I lead is mathematically, geometrically different than his. If you want to add one more, you ask me this one. Have you worried about having enough money for food in the last 12 months. And if I say yes to that one, there's an individual that's not only suffering, but an individual that's very much more dangerous than the person that is just out of work. Now, I just want to tell you quickly, if you said what's the best state of mind, the best life you can have, it's to have a job. This gets pretty soft, you guys. But where the job that you have, you believe has a rich mission and purpose. And it doesn't matter if you work for Twinkies, or it doesn't matter if you have a job that's unbelievable, like an organization like this. If you believe that your job has a mission and purpose, that's good. If you think your opinion counts, that raises you up another rung on the ladder. This one's really soft, but if you want to just predict almost anything about any individual in the world, do you think your boss cares about your development? So if this was a human development organization, you'd say, where have you found human development? You find it in the workplace, and whether or not the mentor actually cares about that individual's development. But that's the very best life, and that's the very worst life. Thank you for having me. I'm going to sit down and take questions.
Thank you so much, Jim. Whoa, I guess you can all hear me. Well, you know, we at Human Rights First, we pride ourselves in not preaching to the choir and in bringing in people from outside the congregation, I would say, to preach to us. So we wanted this to be provocative, and I think it was. You've got a mic down there underneath your chair. We've got, I think, about 10, 15 minutes to have a discussion now, and we have folks with mics around the room, so please raise your hands, and I'm going to pull my chair back just a bit so I can make sure I don't miss people on the other side of the room, and I already saw a few hands back here. Jennifer Windsor.
Hello? Can you hear me? Loudly. Hi. I couldn't agree more with your need to do gather data on suffering. I was previously executive director of Freedom House, which for 35 years or more has been gathering data on various aspects of infringements on human freedom. But I do think that there is room. Freedom House does it in a very broad brush way, but I definitely think there's room to go even further on particular issues of suffering and how they manifest themselves, because I do think it captures the public's attention in a way when you use numbers. And there's lots of questions, oh, is Freedom House's methodology good or bad? But it does drive the conversation. And I think Human Rights First is able to get that more detailed data and could think about that. So just a point to say that there are other organizations in this space that work in a complementary way to Human Rights First.
Great, thank you. Sunny.
Sunny Efren with the State Department. I'd like to draw you out on the correlation between jobs and economic aid, particularly in connection with the Arab Spring, where the U.S. government has increased economic aid. The question is, does that translate into the perception in the people that you're polling that, in fact, the aid is correlated to jobs, or is it just an abstraction of aid coming in, or do people even know that that aid is coming?
It's hard to give you a simple answer on that. But by the way, as far as how the world feels about us on that subject, Middle East, not good. All not good. Africa, very, very high. The differences are profound in how much they think in how much we think they help. You have to be so careful with aid because there's nothing that makes people dislike us more than when you help them, and I think so much of it depends upon how we position it too. And at the very end of the day, I'm trying to make this short, but any place where you have people that have pride in entrepreneurship, this is real different than innovation, those pockets and a place especially where America's helped them, anybody from Kaufman to I don't know who, but when you measure those areas, boy, they get a good feeling about Americans. This is a little corny, but you know, one of the most loving things you can say to anybody overseas, I know this, and that is, we'd like to have you be a partner of ours, or we'd like to have you run the Gallup office in Jeddah or somewhere. The part I was going to say was corny is that a U.S. president made this remark: in the future, our foreign relationships should be based on trade, not on politics. Which president said that? Yeah, he said George Washington. He wins a ride on that duck bus for that one. Yeah, George Washington. But it seems like where we have great trade relationships, and people feel like they're a part of helping something grow. I know that sounds a little Pollyanna, but that's where it works. That's where it works the best.
Yes.
Thanks. My name's Mark Hank, and I work for the Solidarity Center, which is a labor and human rights organization. So thank you for your remarks. I think they're right on the spot. That's what we say almost every day. So I want to ask you about your sense about voice and how people want to express that voice. What are you hearing when you do your surveys about how people think they can express their voice when they haven't been heard in the past?
You know, some of that's really difficult for my organization to deal with. You have, you know, like Egyptians, so we were closely monitored. We were doing monthly polling, you know, leading up to the election, but there's so much illiteracy. It's hard to ask them any questions at all about the conditions of their country. What we do know, what we do have confidence in, is when we ask the person about how they're doing. So that one really works. But asking what kind of opinion do you have with, I mean, do you want Sharia law or whatever it might be? That one's very difficult. Now, in defense, I was just kind of picking on Egypt there, the United States, we have that problem here too. So we're asking questions about fiscal cliff, and by the way, I'm going to say 6 weeks before the election, 40% of registered voters didn't know Mitt Romney was a Mormon. And so you have, you know, the level of education all around the world on questions of what they would like different with government or whatever it might be, or any kind of human rights is very, very, very difficult. But over and over, we don't really see as much. You know, if you take Singapore, I don't know what you call that kind of a government, but everybody wants to be Singapore now. You know all this stuff. You know,
not necessarily. I don't think so.
Well, Kazakhstan and that kind of thing. But obviously, you probably don't have too much freedom. Probably don't have too much freedom of speech in Singapore. But what most people want, first of all, when we ask them, the very most basic, is they want to live a life absent of fear. That was the most simple one we found. And the best question we found, again, with it, all of it, we argued really for over a year with the outside academics, everything else. And the question that works the best is, I feel safe to walk around in my community at night. And that was the single very best one. Second, then up one rung of the ladder, the thing that they wanted second most was food and shelter, almost like a Maslow thing. The next one we found was institutions. You know this, but you know, traffic. There's a lot of things that people are wondering about, but the one we found in institutions was corruption. So what we did is we redid Maslow's hierarchy, but that was about the next third. And we also found, you know, people will say, I'm going to get this over. I feel like I'm getting off track, but the corruption, people get used to it. You know, this is Mexico. We found they don't get used to it at all. It actually exacerbates itself and gets worse. But I would say feeling of safety is what most people want, what their opinions, but it quickly moves very quickly moves to economics. You know, I keep looking at that. I tell intelligence, I tell military, I tell everybody when Mohammed Bouazizi lit himself on fire, he didn't yell "Death to America." He didn't yell "Allahu Akbar." He yelled, "I just want to work." But you get to that one real fast.
Well, I want to just jump in with one question, if I could. You know, I think we take to heart this admonition, Jim, about you know, linking our issues to through data to the will of the people and what's on the minds of people, and you know what I have seen more and more, you know, working on a lot of countries around the world, is, you know, when people say, you were making the distinction between the guy, two people who are out of work and one who is hopeless and one who is not. You know, if you dig deeper on the hopelessness, on the guy who doesn't believe he's ever going to get a job, you don't have to scratch very far, it seems to me, to find a whole panoply of human rights violations in an environment. You know, so for example, if a person believes they're never going to get a job because of corruption, because he's not, you know, part of an inner circle, or because of who he is, you know, race, religion, political opinion, what he believes, then, you know, those are all the issues that, you know, that we spend our time thinking about, but we haven't done a good enough job maybe of connecting them in the public mind, why these things are relevant. My question is about China, because that's the other thing I was struck by in your comments was the distinction between, you know, when some people say about an uprising or a revolution a lot in the Irish Spring, well, where the heck did that come from? You know, because the economic indicators were looking good. China's a place that's often hailed as a rising power and economic model. But when we talk to people there, there's a fair amount of hopelessness for some of the same reasons that I just mentioned. Have you done polling there? Are you finding the same things? What can you tell us about China?
Okay, I was still kind of thinking on that last thing, where I could make maybe a helpful point. Then I'll go right to that. But about the safety, where you have with women in sub-Saharan Africa, my recommendation, I hope I'm not missing the point here, but until you get the fact that women live in fear of being raped or beaten to injury tied to economics, I don't think the world cares. I was still thinking about your question. But what we found is that when you say, when a woman is afraid to walk 300 meters from her house because of fear of rape or beaten to injury, she can't go into town and sell a basket. Or she can't go into town and buy some stuff. This is interesting to me. Georgetown, about 7 years ago, do you remember this? But we had a whole bunch of crime. And my wife said to me, remember a boy's got his throat slit? My wife said to me, you can't walk up after dark, nobody can go up there. You know, sales went way down in Georgetown. Then they came in and kind of fixed it and they went back up again. But the fear, the single first demand of a will of the world goes to economics. But Elisa, China is in a lot better place than India. I'm just kind of benchmarking. One of the things that when we interview the employees, so we do a national study, and the Chinese government let us use their national sampling frames. Most polls you see are just like a Guangzhou, Beijing, Shanghai type thing. We actually go out and interview people in caves and all that kind of that kind of thing. But the people that are in workforces, they are suffering, and I think this is the biggest problem. I like our cards a lot better. You know, I hear, oh, China's coming, and over 50% of Americans think they've already beaten us. But I think the biggest problem that they have is a kind of psychological suffering in the workplace, which is corruption and cronyism. Now, it's real bad in China, but it's actually worse in India. It looks to us like corruption and cronyism in China only goes down about halfway where in India it goes all the way to the street. But the suffering in China is staying pretty constant at around 7 to 9%. That's sort of their stock price. By the way, the right amount of suffering, right amount, is that was a mistake, but is about 3%. That's what America is, and we're just touching 4% right now. So you have China at about, I'd have to look today, but maybe 8%, where India's right up around 30, which is really high.
Thanks. Okay, I saw a question right up here in the front, and then back over here so we can prep.
I'm Angela. My question was just like yours, but I also have a thought too. You know, in China, I think the biggest crisis for the human rights, it is 1 out of 13 Chinese people, they are facing the organ harvesting, you know, when they were alive. Right now, those two are the winners. You're talking about living a life with dignity. There's no way, because both of them were kidnapped from the house. You're talking about 100 million Chinese people. Every day they're facing that human rights dignity, and they don't have a right to live a normal life like us. And they're facing the crisis. They can be put on the operation table and being organ harvested while they were alive. And then how was that poor? I mean, from your data, did it show too? From your
but
pool?
Can you tell me what's the last part of your question again, please?
From your pool, does it show that majority of the Chinese people, even the people that are rich, they don't live a life with dignity, or they don't feel safe, and every day their life is really in danger and fear, and they don't have our privilege like we have. So,
you know, I don't know the answer to your question, but my email is just my name is Jim Clifton. My email is just what you think it would be. It's Jim_Clifton@Gallup.com. And if you type that question to me, I'll send it somewhere and they'll get you the answer.
yes, thank you.
Which is true for anybody else too. But we don't ask about that particular serious problem for a couple of reasons. One reason is it may not be broad enough for us to pull. That's one reason. And remember, in these countries, they take questions out. So in China, we have to sit down with a person, and then they say they take out questions. And I don't think we could ever ask a question as straightforwardly as about human organs. But overall, people in China, as far as hope, their hope's in pretty good shape, and their hopelessness, what you really look for in hopelessness is not the location of the statistic. It's like a stock. The location of the statistic as much as you do the direction and speed. The direction and speed tells you more. And China seems to be maintaining pretty darn well, where other countries, their suffering and hopelessness is skyrocketing. And so I don't know, maybe all of the problems that China has, maybe they haven't added up enough to overcome, which is quite a bit of hope right now. And again, everybody did the same thing. About 10 or 15, all of us would come back from China and India, and we would say, India is the one to watch, not China. I don't know if you did that or not, but I did. I was just wrong. But it seems like although they probably don't have the same abuse of organs sale business, something's much more wrong in India than China.
Okay, we have a question in the back, and then up here with Bill.
Do I have to
wait for the mic? I couldn't see you. Hi, Alan.
Hi, Dr. Alan Keller from NYU School of Medicine. So if I can understand some of the primary points you've made, it's that, well, the so what question matters, and that we need to link in human rights the so what to an economic argument. That said, I respectfully, profoundly disagree with you. There is no shortage of data in terms of human suffering by numbers of displaced persons, by the prevalence of depression, post-traumatic stress, a whole host of other indicators, economic disparities, the gap between the rich and poor. So I actually, to me, it's not to me, as a matter of science, it's not the question of whether we do or don't know. The data, for example, on the global warming, unequivocal. So a question as a pollster that I have to you isn't so much the, well, how do we get the data on this human suffering? How do we get people to care about this data?
Let me just make one remark just for you to keep in mind, okay? But when you get your, I'm going to call it classic economics or traditional transactions of life, let's say from India, the ones that you're referring to. Let's just do one like unemployment. I'm just saying, so from unemployment, you can say, here's the difference, the space between rich and poor, or you get household, all that data. They collect that. You get that 5 years after the fact. That's when they're done collecting it, and then it comes out a year after that. Do you see what I mean? And so much of the classic economics that you're talking about, you are so far behind the curve. And that's one of the problems that I love our intel community, I love our military community, but like what he's talking about, they all deal so far on the right-hand side of the curve. It's like with health care. Rather than preventing health care, we spend $2.5 trillion picking up the litter, because we keep dealing with stuff 5 years after the fact rather than getting on the left-hand side. That's why I think, I'm not arguing with you, I'm just encouraging you. You ought to put some behavioral economics in with the kind of data that you're talking about, because that big data source is a lot richer than just using classic traditional transactions and economics of life, because everything's a trailing indicator that you're working with, where the really good low-hanging fruit, I think, now lies in behavioral economics.
Okay, we have time for one last question, and very fittingly, it's from Bill Zabel, the chairman of our board. And the mic is coming, Bill.
Thank you. I'd like to know what the American people feel about human rights, according to your polls. And then the second question is, do they feel America should lead by example the world on the cause of human rights?
I feel kind of bad because I feel like you've stumped the band with your question, because when we ask Americans about issues, this one's low. It's right there with environment and all that. And should it be? But everything has changed so much. But even like our role in the world with military, Americans don't want that for a long time again. And so what's moved to the very top is, of course, jobs and economics. And there's nothing else. And that's why I'm making the recommendation about somehow everything's got to be changed back to that real strong will now for it to be relevant. But I think human rights, environment, foreign policy is a leadership issue. But the way the voice of 5 billion adults in the world are more like, I want to say customers. I know that's not a very good word, but I think they're more customers of leadership, and leadership has to make sure that they know what's on their minds. And you can't imagine how big I am on the will of the world, and that people ought to have a voice, but there's not a very big voice. People don't think much about human rights right now outside of their own world.
Well, one thing, it's somewhat of an occupational hazard if you work in the field of human rights to be a glass half full kind of person. But I take away from this, I know you were trying to give us a little bit of tough love, Jim, But I'm actually encouraged because going back to Alan's question, you know, how do you make people care? I think we've gotten some very useful information about how you make people care, because while I agree that there's a lot of data about suffering, and there could, as Jennifer said, be a lot more, the fact is, for those of us who work in human rights, we know the connection between these issues of hopelessness and well-being, whether it's economic or security, and respect for human rights. What I hear coming from Jim is a challenge that we have to make that more plain to people in the United States and around the world, to get people to understand this linkage, and therefore to demand that the United States lead on this issue.
So, and I also want to, I'm trying to be helpful, but this is just a thing that we did with Meridian. It's called Global States of Mind. And if you can't find it on our website, email me and I'll send it to you. But it has like the 10 countries that are that have the highest hope, have the lowest hope, have the most fear, the lowest fear, migration patterns of 7 billion people, about 800 million of them want to leave their countries permanently, where they want to go, the most that want to get out. But there's a lot of data that you can just have and include in all of your research that I hope that you'll use and to help make your case.
Great, Jim. Thank you. Let's all join me in thanking Jim Clifton for a very provocative presentation.